Welcome to Joffier Whispers. My name is Ngaire. This is a recording from February this year, and as we come to the end of 2024, it still feels relevant. Most of us have a strong sense that our collective lives will be changed forever over the next year or so, and not just because of the coming US election. Those peoples or entities controlling the planet are so removed from our reality, the reality of our personal lives, and the development of artificial intelligence is progressing so rapidly, there is more and more evidence that we are actually at great risk of losing our humanity, of what it is that makes us human. We are at risk of losing connections to ourselves, to one another, to God, or whatever that energy is beyond our immediate experience, to fundamental truths about our reality, to our true history, to what is real for us on a personal level as we experience life in the form of a human being. The subject of knowledge, what is knowledge in a more profound sense? How do we access true knowledge rather than second-hand opinion? How do we clarify the implications of true knowledge as we transition through this current revolution during this unprecedented time in history, is something we should all be considering deeply and seriously. In 1970, an American writer, futurist and businessman by the name of Alvin Toffler wrote a very influential book entitled Future Shock, which most of you have probably never heard of, but it was a New York Times bestseller and raised awareness that at some time in the foreseeable future, the world would change in an unprecedented way, leading to huge disruption and possible destruction of our way of life. A film of the same name, narrated by the late Orson Welles, was produced in 1973, and it can be found online. It runs for about 45 minutes and was highly disturbing. It is highly disturbing. It's like a precursor to The Matrix, one might say. I'll put the link below if you want to have a look at it. It's quite interesting, given that it was created more than 50 years ago. The term future shock meant huge psychological disturbances that would come out of too much change in too short a period of time, expressing itself as an illness or mass psychosis. Toffler actually stated that people would begin to lose their minds and we would need to redefine the meaning of insanity. And we have indeed moved into that sphere over the last few years with fear-based anxiety around climate change, gender confusion, aliens, possible nuclear war, racial issues, mass genocide, financial realities, and religion, among other things. The book was written before most people alive today were born, and only those of us who are old enough to have read it in its original form, myself included, have been in a position to watch his predictions meld into a new reality, a world that people of my age no longer recognise. And some of you who are younger will also have seen dramatic changes in your lives. I saw a street survey some time ago where people were asked the simple question, can men have babies? It was surprising how many people said yes. That is truly dystopian, and the question is, do those people really believe that? Or have they been brainwashed into not trusting their own sense of reality, so they can't separate fact from fiction? The other question is, why do they believe it? Is it something they actually know, or are they tapping into public or media opinion? Anyone who is in touch with reality will know it's impossible for men to give birth for basic biological reasons. Another subject is the current situation in the Middle East. To punish hundreds of thousands of people for a small-scale, albeit shocking, crime by a few of their members is insane. For the world to stand by and allow it to happen is insane, because retribution will continue on both sides indefinitely, and because if most of us uphold the sanctity of life, and I would suggest most of us do, then it's inhuman to perpetuate it. There but for the grace of God go I. Those who support such atrocities may well be the next victims. It's pretty clear we're in the midst of future shock right now. We are witnessing a kind of collective insanity which I suspect will become increasingly problematic over the next couple of years. So let's come back to the subject of knowledge. There are so many conversations, so many opinions out there on the internet. How do we determine what we should take as fact, as a valuable addition to our knowledge base? Knowledge, from gnosis, meaning information, and ledge, as in ledger, a record of something. Are we really absorbing knowledge, or is it just opinion? I would contend that most so-called information on the internet is either opinion or propaganda, much of it designed to tap into our basic fears and manipulate us into watching a particular channel or exhibiting particular behaviours as a result. Another American writer named Walter Lippmann published a book entitled Public Opinion in 1922, 50 years before Alvin Toffler's famous work. And there's an interesting video online which is a condensation of that book if you'd like to read a summary of the work. I'll put the link below. It's very clearly written for those of us who haven't the time or patience to delve into such weighty matters. Lippmann's basic contention is that democracy doesn't work. And I'll try to simplify why that was his contention. If you have a group of people with common interests and common needs, dependent on one another for survival, and you nominate a representative to promote the interests of the group to a higher organisational level, then there's a good chance that the needs of all or almost all members will be accommodated. However, when there's a really large population composed of a number of these groups, then that combination of groups will need to nominate a representative at an even higher level of management. So a tiered system develops where the needs of the lowest layers become suffused into the higher levels and watered down in such a way that they no longer have a representative with whom they can have an intimate contact. Chinese whispers. While it's relatively easy to manage the interests of those one level down, the next layer down appears non-existent and becomes a homogenised mass to those above. How can the higher levels know what the needs of the lower levels are? And do they even care? The lowest level becomes a teeming mass of humanity rather than individuals who have particular needs. And of course, those higher up tend to develop financial and personal interests and begin to compete with one another, forgetting that they are representing or meant to represent the rest of us, and probably not even caring. They have no vested interest in the welfare of the masses. Democracy only works, according to Machiavelli, I think it was, in a population of around 150,000 people or less. So you can see where this is heading, the pyramid effect, and I wonder what percentage of humanity actually understands that. If you're watching this podcast, it will probably be self-evident to you, but I suspect not to the most of humanity, not yet. If you try to suggest to people that the government level of control is well down the pyramid, perhaps around the middle, you can be met with a blank stare. Many people are now looking at the idea of a communist state as a solution, but history has proved that communism isn't a solution and always leads to mass genocide when its ideals are implemented. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli describes a number of different forms of organisation, and he certainly considered both democracy and communism to be flawed. He considered a benevolent dictatorship to be the best form of organisation, but the operative word is, of course, benevolent. One might imagine that a benevolent dictatorship could work quite well because all levels of society could share common goals, but that isn't the reality. The population as a whole will never have common goals. Mao Zedong began as a benevolent leader, and look where that ended. Power corrupts. That's a universal reality. Here's a question. What is the goal of life? What's the purpose of life? You might answer with the self-evident truth: to reproduce itself. Okay, have a look at nature. That is the purpose of life. But likewise, all functioning entities have the same goal: to reproduce themselves. There is some kind of universal function that supports that idea. So you have governments, for instance, whose sole purpose is to reproduce themselves, to reproduce further versions of their current status. Over recent years, it has become increasingly clear that governments in power will go to great lengths to ensure their continuity into the future by any means possible, corrupt or otherwise, even to the extent of murdering contenders, opposite contenders. Their purpose is not to support the interests of those individuals who have no value within their own sphere, but only to draw as many resources as possible from the majority of the population to sustain themselves. They operate in a different realm, and inevitable as it might be, there is something inherently wrong with that at some level. This is the Machiavellian dilemma. Machiavelli confides to the prince, and I quote, "Do not look to be loved by the people, look to be feared by them." Now, the word fear could be interpreted in many ways. Let's say what he meant was you need to have their respect. They need to be in awe of you. He goes on to say, "It must be understood, however, that a prince cannot observe all of these virtues," meaning the prince cannot always be caring and benevolent, "for which men are reputed good, because it's often necessary to act against mercy, against faith, against humanity, against frankness, against religion, in order to preserve the state. Thus he must be disposed to change according as the winds of fortune and the alternations of circumstances dictate. As I have already said, he must stick to the good as long as he can, but being compelled by necessity, he must be ready to take the way of evil." Unquote. Machiavelli well understood that in order to survive, the state must eventually, when public confidence and support diminishes, assert itself at all costs. We see that happening right now, mostly through online censorship of those who criticise the government and current political narratives. Ask yourself why, in a supposed democracy, debate is stifled. Whose interests are served by that? But where did that idea come from, do you think, the need to preserve the state at all costs? Why must the state be preserved at all costs? I'll leave it to you to ponder on those questions, but they are very relevant to where we are right now. But I think most of us who are aware of what's really going on in the world will understand that we have reached that point where our states are not serving the interests of the population as a whole, but are trying to preserve the state at all costs. It should be pretty clear by now that there is a massive depopulation agenda in order to preserve resources and keep them in the hands of a privileged few. Add together the control of the population through fear, the attempt to drive us into a state of compliance, the pharmaceutical agenda that enforces acceptance of an injected poisonous substance on the masses, with escalating and unprecedented rates of infertility and death as a result, social conditioning to accept gender dysphoria as a natural phenomenon, and persuading populations to isolate themselves from one another, the mass genocides that are taking place in the Middle East. And it should be obvious that this is a time where the state is asserting itself at all costs by attempting to turn us against one another. This is not a deduction based on public opinion. It's a deduction based on empirical evidence, clearly indicated by the personal experience of increasing numbers of people whose lives have been detrimentally impacted by existing and projected government policies, which are now thankfully available online if you care to look for them. The evidence is clear if one takes the trouble to look for it. Nevertheless, it is impossible for most people like you and me to see the depth of those machinations. We have no way of moving into that sphere and experience what is going on behind the scenes. So how do we move beyond that? How do we survive? Well, there is already an increasing trend to distrust the media, especially mainstream media, that I feel will continue. But we need to be honest, to look for the truth rather than latch on to opinions that appear to support our own biases, whether personal or collective, and get caught up in fanciful stories that are taking us down the wrong track. There are many out there who seriously believe we haven't been to the moon or believe the flat earth theory. Why do they believe it? Because if they took the trouble to find out what the evidence is that the earth is round, well, kind of round, rather kooky, wobbly shape really, they would know it can't possibly be flat. Many flight routes from North America to Asia cross the Arctic these days because it's a shorter distance than flying longitudinally. Any mathematician can do calculations that shows how that works, given we live on a globe rather than a flat plane. It's provable. But no one has yet proven that the earth is flat, so why do people believe it? Because once people begin to understand that they can't trust what they once believed to be true, they begin to question everything. And that's not a bad thing, but to just blindly supplant one apparent myth with another isn't smart. It's not about seeking knowledge, but just substituting one myth, one public opinion for another. That kind of thinking defies logic. It's not thinking at all. We come back to Walter Lippmann and his book Public Opinion. He says that communications become watered down when information is shared by large numbers of people. Back to Chinese whispers. If I hear the words, "a friend told me," or "I saw on the news last night," I know I'm not going to receive verified information. Those words don't mean what they are about to say is true. It's just idle chatter if there's no verification. Lippmann also claims that most public opinion is based on archetypes, archetypal beliefs. In other words, beliefs based on a mythological premise rather than a reality. So let's take climate change, for instance, because that's one of the current distractions. If you are persuaded to use less power or buy an electric car in the interests of addressing climate change, then the first question isn't how to deal with climate change, but to question whether the phenomenon of climate change really exists. Perhaps it's more of a symbol of a problem rather than the problem itself. We are being asked to address an issue that may not be real, but is adopted on the basis of a mythological belief rather than a physical reality. Or even if climate change is real, perhaps the mythological belief is that it will be detrimental to life on Earth. It may not be, but the fear of the possibility stimulates us to believe that climate change is a threat. And why has that belief been promoted? Whose interests are best served if we adopt policies which diminish the quality of our lives? Carbon dioxide is one of the elements we breathe. It's in the air around us and always has been at various levels. Are higher carbon dioxide levels hazardous for us? Perhaps, but only if we're not receiving enough oxygen and hydrogen, which are always in the air. Plants need carbon dioxide for respiration, so perhaps raised carbon dioxide levels are a blessing because the planet will become greener. Now please Don't go and tell your friends I've said that carbon dioxide is good for you or that climate change is not true. I haven't said that. I'm just putting forward a proposal based on observation, not making a statement of fact. I'm posing a question, not giving the answer. There's a difference. None of us have the time or the energy to know the truth about most aspects of life, so where can our truth lie? How can we gain knowledge and use it effectively? Most of us are flawed in our thinking. Just recognising that is a good start. We can lie within your own sphere. If someone tells you, for instance, a common acquaintance is a liar or a thief, do you believe them or do you trust the acquaintance until such times as that accusation is evidently true? Most people don't do that. They believe the gossip. The only way to really know what is true is through personal experience or watching a variety of conversations about a subject until a pattern emerges. Patterns of behaviour and phenomena are a good indicator. I personally believe that one of the most important subjects that should be taught in schools is logic. Logical thought is healthy. Irrational thought can be really harmful. That should be obvious, but logical thinking doesn't come readily to most of us. We need to learn it as fundamental to our thinking processes. It's a process of deduction that needs to be learned, like musical scales or basic mathematics. The principle of logic, though, is very simple. Either something exists or it doesn't. If you have no evidence that something exists, then it's not healthy to adopt the belief that it does exist. If you don't have evidence that something exists, then other questions need to be asked because it's not always the whole story. And we can apply that to the rest of our lives. If something exists, how important is it to know? Will it affect your life positively or negatively? What are the implications of it? Why does it exist? The answer to more questions is a way of leading to the truth. If I can't prove something, then I must let it go or give it space to evolve. We can't get caught up in all sorts of emotional dilemmas because we're encouraged to believe something is a threat, that's the usual direction, that may not even be real. It was extraordinary to see during the pandemic scare how people would change overnight in their thinking and behaviour. When masking up was first implemented, there was absolutely no evidence in the environment nor in people's personal lives that would indicate the threat was real, and yet their behaviour altered suddenly, as though someone had pulled a switch or they were under attack. Until that moment, life seemed pretty normal. Nothing had changed. And yet people were suddenly terrified of one another just because they had been given a regulation that they had to adhere to at a particular moment in time. And that fear showed in their eyes. That one moment in time changed everything, despite the fact that there was no evidence of a real threat, only television reports. And we know media thrives on bad news, real or fabricated. It just wasn't logical behaviour. It felt insane. I'm using that period of time because it's an easy one to talk about since the shadows of it still remain and it was a worldwide phenomenon. Here's another thing that's illogical about that time. I checked Australian statistics on mortality rates over that period of time and discovered a long list of causes of mortality. Influenza was way down the list, which was strange because about 4,000 to 6,000 people usually die every year of that condition. The mortality rate from the pandemic in that chart was only represented at the very bottom of the list under the heading died with COVID present, not died of COVID. And it was at the bottom of the list. There were hardly any deaths. This was 2022. Last time I checked that page, it had been removed. But if I point, and I can't find any similar information, they're not putting it on the government website anymore, mortality rates. That's very interesting. But if I pointed out to people at that time that there were so few deaths from influenza suddenly, but the number who died from COVID had increased, most people, their explanation was just that the flu fatalities were down due to masking. But they didn't take the next step, which is, well, if the mask works for flu, why doesn't it work for COVID? You can't have it both ways. They're both viruses. If I pointed that out to people, you could see their eyes would glaze over. They had no answer. They just were incapable of thinking it through logically. And the whole thing was based on a mythological premise. Mythological because nobody proved it was true. There's no evidence it was true. We seem to have collectively lost the capacity for critical thinking, and that is really troubling. It makes us incredibly vulnerable. The interesting thing about those times, in fact all the issues that seem to dominate the media at the moment, is that the majority of people not only appear to still accept everything that comes from their television sets as truth, but seem to lack comprehension that there's a large world out there and many stories to be told. So the selection that finds its way into your living room is the result of individual journalistic and editorial biases. And in the scheme of things, they're probably, if not possibly, not the most important matters to be addressed at any one point in time. In other words, it's not you and me who are deciding what are the important issues in our lives, but a select body of people who gain our attention by creating drama that may or may not be of relevance to us personally. You know the saying, no news is good news. Back to Walter Lippmann, said in his book, words, like money, are tokens of value. They represent meaning, therefore, just as money. Their representative value goes up and down. So when we converse with one another, we have a tendency to attach meaning to what we hear, which may not even be the intention of the speaker. Words have meaning. And if you know anything about linguistics, you'll understand that the intrinsic meaning of most of our vocabulary has been distorted over many, many generations. The implication being that if a speaker knows the intrinsic meaning of a word, which is used in a particular context, then if the perverted version is accepted as real to the listener, it's so easy to deceive that listener into not hearing the real meaning because it is clouded in newspeak. In other words, if I know the real meaning of a word and I use it, but you have a different meaning for it, then I can use that word to get you to accept something that isn't actually meant by that word. Lippmann also stated that mass media content is a socially created product, not a reflection of an objective reality. And I come back to the fact that most people receive their information from television rather than from source. Television reporting is a social construct, not a reflection of reality. It's just public opinion based on our collective fears and biases. Lippmann also wrote, mass media content is a socially created product, not a reflection of an objective reality. My advice to you, for what it's worth, is to be sceptical about everything you hear from the media and open your eyes to what is really going on behind the illusion. Listen to the people. If you listen to news reports about something that's happened and you see short clips of people speaking, most of us know they've been edited. If you really want to know what that person is saying you have to go to the whole interview. You can't look at those clips and accept them as true. Here's another quote from Lippmann. There can be no liberty for a community which lacks the means by which to detect lies. It requires wisdom to understand wisdom. The music means nothing if the audience is deaf. And finally, let me end on this final quote from Lippmann. When we all think alike, no one is thinking. Thank you for joining me. If you'd like to find out a little bit about me, you can go to my website, ngairej.com. There's a brief autobiography there. You can look at my paintings, listen to some of my music, and there are a few articles there around the visual arts. I hope to see you next time. In the meantime, stay well, stay blessed.